Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Matt Grossman as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce today's guest. Dr. Matt Grossman is the director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research and professor of political science at Michigan State University. A leading scholar in American politics, he explores how evidence and diversity strengthen social science. His books, How Social Science Got Better and Red State Blues, examine political polarization, economic shocks, and the limit of conservative governance. Professor Grossman also co-authored Asymmetric Politics, winner of the American Political Science Association's Leon Epstein Award. Beyond academia, he is a senior fellow at the Nisa-Nen Center, host of the Science of Politics podcast, and contributor to 538. As Institute for Public Policy and Social Research Director since 2016, his expanded research impact, faculty engagement, and student leadership across Michigan's policy landscape. In today's episode, Professor Matt Grossman joins us to unpack the central ideas from his acclaimed book, Artist of the Possible, Governing Networks and American Policy Change since 1945. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Matt Grossman to the conversation. Professor Matt, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Professor, your book argues that governing networks, rather than just presidents, parties, or public opinion, drive most major domestic policy changes since 1945. When you first started this project, what common story about how policy happens did you most want to overturn?
I think the faux idea out there that this book is kind of a contrast to is that the public kind of sets the agenda and then elects politicians to enact that agenda, and then they do. And the much more common story in American history is that parties and interest groups come together to enact a widely acceptable proposal that occurs as often behind the scenes as in front of the cameras.
Professor, you reviewed 268 books and reports across 14 major issue areas to map American domestic policy history. What did their wide-angle synthesis reveal that individual case studies or single-issue histories usually miss?
Well, the overall aim here was to cover the domestic policy spectrum, all of the major issue areas where the federal government has been acting, and to not necessarily focus on any one, set of events. It turns out that if you have a theory of American policymaking, there's at least one case that fits that theory. And so that means that if you don't cover the whole spectrum, you might get kind of a misleading picture of how policy change happens. And that's not just theoretical. We have whole parts of the sort of policy theory space that have been mostly about budget politics or mostly about environmental politics. And it turns out that they selected the cases that most align with the theories. So this was an effort to counteract that. It did have a cost. The cost is I have to take the historian's word for it about why things happen. So I wasn't able to do my own systematic analysis of every major policy change since 1945. I had to say, according to the experts who've looked at a long history of policymaking in this area, who were the most important actors, what were the most important precursors.
Professor, a core question in the book is whether policymakers lead the American public or mainly organized interests and insiders. After tracing 6 decades of policy change, how did you find the public clearly in the driver's seat?
Well, the public is not at the start of the process either for kind of what issues get addressed or which solutions are selected for those issues. That doesn't mean they lack influence. There are cases where public opinion polls have been referenced repeatedly by politicians. There are places where election results with clear campaign manifestos get translated into policy. So it's not that there are no cases where that mattered, but it's just not the norm. The norm is that we have interest groups and experts and parts of political parties and congressional committees working on things for a long time. And what allows things to move forward is a compromise on a solution that satisfies a big enough coalition to move forward. So both kinds of things happen, but the public, isn't always at the start.
Professor, you explicitly challenge some of the most common theories in political science about parties, interest groups, and public opinion. Which widely taught theory did your evidence most decisively undermine, and how?
Well, I think it didn't, like I said, there's no theory where I said this theory is inconsistent with all policy change. It's just that everybody is kind of taking one piece of it. And what I found is that it's often because they had a particular case in mind when they were formulating the theory. But we wouldn't want to, rely. It's fine to rely on people who study the civil rights movement, for example, for its impact on American politics. But we wouldn't want to conclude from that we always get policy change when there's a major protest, because obviously it's specific to some things that happen in that policy area. So that's what I usually find. The most common kind of expectation I don't really think is a theory in political science. So there's no theory in political science that says the public always determines what issues policymakers address and then always gets its way in policy change. But that is kind of the baseline expectation, that we want to measure how far away is policymaking from that kind of faux theory of American policymaking. And so I don't view my effort to say, well, often it's pretty far from that, I don't think undermines any particular like political science theory. It just might say that we kind of had the wrong starting point in our expectations.
Professor, you cover everything from healthcare and welfare to civil rights, education, and environmental policy across the post 1945 era. Did you find particular areas where policy changed in ways that defied your general model of governing network?
There are places where there's no policy area where most policy changes were a product of public opinion or a product of election results or a product of media coverage or protests. Those are always kind of minority factors in explanations for policy change. But there was variation. There are places, one of the most interesting is energy and environmental policy are often considered one policy domain, but actually they have operated completely differently. Energy policy has always been a kind of an insider, industry-driven, economic policy area, whereas environmental policy has often been a much more public, more cultural dimension of politics, and dividing the parties more directly. So sometimes the policies that we kind of put together in a package don't really fit in that package when it comes to, how they are addressed in the policymaking system.
Professor, popular political history and presidential biographies often cast president as the main artist of the possible. After your analysis, how much credit or blame do you think presidents actually deserve compared to long-running policy networks?
Well, on the one hand, presidents are the most credited policymakers with policy change. So if you are going to attend to only one person in Washington, it's worth attending to the president. But on the other hand, many things can happen really without much presidential influence. And in the contemporary era, the presidential influence or involvement tends to polarize. It tends to move the parties to their respective sides. So it may no longer sort of be helping move things along to have the president very involved. But I also am attentive to the fact that this might, we're looking for as broad theory as we can find, but that doesn't mean that this isn't also about the very particular history of some people and some time periods. And so Often today's liberal or progressive politicians will look back to the Great Society in the 1960s and early 1970s and say, that they want to emulate that. And what I find is that there's a very particular set of circumstances that was kind of brought together in the governing network that led that era. And one of them, though, was the presidents. We just had successive presidents who had come out of Congress and come out of an interest group community, and they had very close ties with all of the other people who were making policies. So, we've heard this story about Lyndon Johnson, for example, but it's also true of Nixon and Ford. It was, even though Kennedy was considered not that experienced, he still had more congressional experience. So, it was a particular era where the presidents were involved in policymaking and already knew the other actors who were involved.
Professor, you integrate studies of lobbyists, think tanks, advocacy groups, and policy experts into your account of change. Among these actors, who turned out to be the most consistently influential in setting and sustaining the national policy agenda?
The main lesson is that you get these serial policy entrepreneurs and organizations that are seen as kind of big stand-ins for sectors of society. So the Chamber of Commerce, the AFL-CIO, the NAACP, these very long-running interest groups that both have some claim to representation and some claim to expertise. These are the actors who tended to kind of have repeated influence on policymaking. So it and often in areas when they were represented by different people. So I don't necessarily think it's because there was one leader and they were particularly effective. I think it was more about kind of how policymaking revolves around trying to create large enough coalitions for something to pass, which often says, well, who are the biggest players here? Who could get us the most credibility in moving this along? And so people kind of go back to the repeated same interests over and over.
Professor, across 60 years of domestic policy, you highlight how policy change is often incremental and path dependent, even after big reforms. What surprised you most about how much didn't change, despite major political turnovers and crises?
Policymaking has always been slower than people wanted it to be. Um, but I sort of try to reconcile liberal and conservative complaints about the process because I think both are correct. I think the conservative complaint is most things that governments do or try to do tend to expand the size and scope of government. We tend to debate whether and how much to do something new in government rather than kind of to stop doing anything that we're currently doing. And that is true. What liberals say is there's all these policy problems out there that we don't address. And so the most common outcome is for nothing to happen. And so that is a big, so from the conservative perspective, it's a big bias in favor of liberalism. Most things that pass expand government responsibility. From the liberal perspective, it's a bias towards conservatism. The most common outcome is for nothing to happen. And both of those things are true. The most common outcome is an incremental liberal expansion, a small expansion of what we're already doing into a new area.
Professor, your findings raise hard questions about democratic representation and whose preferences get translated into law. After writing this book, are you more optimistic or more skeptical about how well American policymaking reflects the broader public?
It's reflective of the public, but not necessarily in the way that people think about it as it should be. So, for example, if you just, we've have data where people ask public opinion poll questions about whether people support a policy proposal, and the average proposal gets the support of like 65, 70% of Americans. So, from that perspective, you might say there's all this out there that the public supports that's not happening. And that's true. Our system has a pretty high bar for passage, a pretty big status quo bias. And on the other hand, What does pass ends up having usually a large supermajority coalition, not just with the public, but with both political parties, with interest groups from different sectors of society. So, in that sense, it is representative. Now, things have changed recently, but not necessarily in the ways that people expect them to change. So, we know we're polarized now. We know the parties have different positions on almost every issue. And so what people want to happen is, well, now I'll wait for my party to get it fully in charge, and then I'll enact my full agenda. And you can tell that that's kind of inconsistent with how historically things have usually been done. Occasionally, we do get something like that, right? With the Affordable Care Act or the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, where one party really does enact something on its own. But actually, those things tend to be subject to partial repeals. They tend to be subject to slowing implementation. They tend to be associated with recalcitrant states and private sector actors. So um, you can enact some policies if you have full control. They tend to be watered down from their initial proposals, and then by the time they're actually implemented, they tend to reflect the influence of the other side as well. So I'd say two ways to look at that. If your expectation is the purpose of democratic government is when the people want something, then they get it, especially right away, then we're going to fall quite short of that expectation. But if the expectation is the things that government does are going to be broadly reflective of the sides and perspectives of society, then I think you'll find more support for that.
Professor Matt, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. For advocates working now on issues like health reforms, climate policy, or inequality, what practical lessons from artists of the possible should they internalize about how to actually move policy in a system dominated by governing networks?
I think policymakers know that they have to, round up big coalitions, that they have to work hard on the details of policy proposals. I think some of what I find just reinforces how hard that is, but how important that is. It's a long-term process. It often requires lots of iterations of a policy proposal. It requires compromises that people may not want to make. It requires going around to everyone who might be potentially opposed to something and finding out, well, is there anybody who can be brought on board with a tweak of this? And it often requires multiple tries. You often do not get a bill introduced in one legislature that's then enacted, but often the proposals are developed while they wait for political circumstances to move in their favor. The other lesson might be a little bit less appreciated, which is that a lot can happen behind the scenes without raising a whole lot of public attention or becoming a center of disagreement between the political parties. So, energy policy, for example, I have mentioned, but just to make it a little bit more concrete, this was a huge effort in the Biden administration to enact a huge changes in energy policy on party line votes. But most of those have either been overturned or dramatically slowed in the very next administration, such that you're not going to see a whole lot of results from that. But think back to the George W. Bush energy bill, which at the time was seen as a big pro fossil fuel bill, but actually included some provisions on solar and wind energy and some tax credits that actually now people look back on and they say that's really what made solar to be cost competitive was these kinds of interventions that we did in the early 2000s in a bill that people didn't even think was about that. So often you get the sort of effective policy from these places where you can ask kind of what small steps can we take now that might not be very controversial, and often those end up being quite influential later on if you can get everyone on board.
Thank you, Professor Matt, for sharing such thoughtful insights from artists of the possible and for helping us to see how governing networks really shape American policy. Your work gives us a rich, more realistic picture of how changes happen and what it takes to make it possible. Thank you once again.
Thank you.